And you're going to show the screen.
Yes.
Right away.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another presentation of Bagel U. This time it is on an interesting subject of heretics and heresy, presented by two people who, to some extent, see themselves as being heretics, and you'll hear about what the subject means and hear a little bit about our stories.
We are brothers in heresy.
Our brothers in heresy.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
So there's a long history to this subject, and a very painful one too, in many ways. And so we're going to try to unfold the nature of this and why it is that it happens and why it's so powerful.
I think that, you know, for us at KHN, it's particularly interesting. It's sort of a personal issue because we're a Reconstructionist synagogue, and the founder, Mordecai Kaplan, who founded Reconstructionism, was excommunicated for his teachings that were counter to Orthodox Judaism.
I want to add that we could be on that, that billboard. I misbehaved. I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish home and became really heretical because I felt like I was given no choices. David, my partner here in Heresy, received every opportunity, everything was available to him, and still he rebelled.
Right. I appreciate all those opportunities, but we'll get into why I did what I did, which constitutes heresy in many minds.
A little bit of background. The stories of Judaism, filled with a mighty God, the creator of everything, who set down a few rules. This God rewarded submission and punishment for those who diverged. A God who selected the Hebrews as his chosen people.
Yeah, well, and as we'll see, leave it to the Jews, who have been first in many ways and innovators. They were the first heretics, officially identified as the first heretics by Constantine the Great in 313. He wasn't great for the Jews, but he established Christianity as the state religion. And so that's really where heresy begins.
The ancient Hebrews were tribal long before democracy. It was an authoritarian system of allegiance to a tribe with customs, cosmic stories, rituals. You set the community above the individual.
I mean, we look at who is a heretic here, and 5 out of the 6 are Jews. And it's interesting briefly to look at what their heresy consisted of. Maimonides, one of the greatest of the Jewish scholars, wrote the Mishnah Torah, which is a cornerstone of Jewish scholarship, was excommunicated when he wrote a book, Guide for the Perplexed, where he tried to marry and compare Aristotle's philosophy with the Talmud. And that definitely did not sit well with the rabbis of southern France, who formally excommunicated him. Spinoza, young guy, 25 years old, one of the greatest of the young scholars of his congregation, which came from Portugal to get established in Amsterdam, had a father who was one of the leaders of the temple. The day his father died, he then announces his challenge to the accepted orthodoxy by the rabbis and is formally excommunicated for it.
That synagogue, which stands today in Amsterdam, was organized by Marranos. These were people who had been forced to accept Christianity. They lived for a period of time, and those who were able to escape the rule under Islam and got to after and had a new freedom, and they returned to Judaism, created that synagogue. And because they had lived through that, they were very stern about maintaining their practices.
Yeah, he challenged the authority of the temple, divine inspiration, miracles, and obviously was punished for it. It's interesting to note that he went on to become regarded by many as the father of modernity. One of the quotes, and from I forget who it was, called him the renegade who gave us modernity. So
yeah, we'll go on to the next, please, Jerry. We want to examine now what is heresy. And by definition, well, here's a classic definition. Heresy is an opinion or doctrine that is at variance with established beliefs and customs, particularly the accepted beliefs or religious laws of a religious organization. It pretty stands to for some more unfolding. We have beliefs that we believe to be true. We think of them as being as correct. And where does that come from? Usually that's a gut reaction. Usually it comes from being raised in a community, being taught by those people who love us or take care of us, whose opinions we respect. And for example, those who grew up in rural households where they have guns, of course, everybody should have guns.
yeah, well, that's the orthodoxy, right?
Yes.
In Iowa, is that where it is?
Yes, it's in the Constitution.
And I would also look at what is heresy, sort of another source definition, because originally, as I said before, it was a Christian concept that is destructive of the virtues of Christian faith. And the Jews were identified first. Tertullian, who was an early Christian writer, said and this was in 313, at the time that Constantine proclaimed Christianity as the empire's religion. From the Jew, the heretic has accepted guidance that Jesus was not the Christ. And this was a tag that obviously not only stayed on the Jew, but was really fundamental to the establishment of anti-Semitism.
So we'll move on to the next and be a little bit more specific. What is Judaic heresy? So here's one definition. Jewish heresy refers to those beliefs which contradict the traditional doctrines of rabbinic Judaism, including theological beliefs and opinions about the practices of halacha.
And halacha is really Jewish law.
But it is from the Torah and rabbinic teachings. There are rules and customs that are extended to the group. And it's part of a sect, family kind of practice. It is a belief that this is correct.
You know, the interesting thing about Judaic heresy is that all of the heretics that we identified, Kaplan, Maimonides, Spinoza, were all deeply knowledgeable about halakha. They all studied, they knew the Torah in and out, they knew the Talmud and the writings. So their heresy came from a profound, informed view of Jewish law. And so therefore their heresy of positing a different idea about those same laws was all the more powerful, which accounts for why the reaction to them was so powerful. They were so influential.
What these heretics were proposing is that there's more than just belief and acceptance, that there was the use of rationality.
Reason.
Maimonides was a physician. He studied that. He understood cause and effect. He really had Aristotelian, scientific ideas,
right,
which was not very prevalent, which made him a good doctor, which made him a good judge of how, of cause and effect. So he wanted to apply that to Judaism, which is actually what Kaplan did.
Right. It's fascinating. There's a a rabbi that I study with, or I learn with, as he says, which I like. And I talked to him about Maimonides, and I said, I talked to you about secular knowledge, mathematics, the arts, music, things that are so expansive, and you diminish all of them. Well, what about Maimonides? He was an astronomer, a philosopher, a mathematician. He was physician to the Sultan, for goodness sakes. He said, yes, but he was Maimonides. He was Maimonides, and all of those things were so subordinated to his life work, which was halakha. So he sort of drew a circle around Maimonides, but not for the normal orthodoxy.
So how are heretics treated? We'll go to the next slide. Here's some examples. Stoning,
Ouch.
burning at the stake, execution by any means,
Okay.
torture in different ways,
Mhm.
forfeiture in many different ways, full social isolation, deprogramming, and we'll get into that soon with David, shunning.
So which would you prefer?
Stoning.
Stoning? Because it's over
No, I don't
quick?
know. That's
Better
classical.
than fire?
I want to be classical.
So listen, at this point, every time I see this slide, I think of a poem by Robert Frost, and I'm just going to say an excerpt called Fire and Ice, and it's a wonderful poem if any of you want to read it. But in pertinent part, he says, from what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if I had to perish twice for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. So, yeah, fire and ice and all other manner.
I want to add a personal story, and I don't have that on the list here, but it might include shaming. When I was a child and I misbehaved, there must have been many occasions when I was disruptive in the eyes of my father. And in his frustration, he would yell at me, he would call me an apocaurus. I assumed that wasn't a compliment. 40 years later, I finally learned of what that sounded, rang a bell, and I discovered that apocaurus is really the name of Epicurus. And in learning about Epicurus, the Greek philosopher, he was teaching about the understanding and appreciation the God-given senses. Now, if you eat good food, doesn't mean you're a glutton, which is the association. But to appreciate, to understand that you have these senses that were given to you, to recognize it and appreciate that. So
you are an Epicurean.
Yes,
you are.
yes,
I've
yes.
seen it. I've seen it up close.
Yes. So I learned that.
Corned beef hash.
Yes, yes, yes. So I accepted that charge.
Sort of sacrilegious.
Yes.
Is corned beef hash okay?
Depends on what it's made of. Okay, next, please.
Power of heresy today.
Yes. Heresy is thought to be of no contemporary interest. We get shocked when suddenly we read about honor killings. It doesn't happen often in the United States, but lots of other places it does. Beheadings, fatwas, deprogramming, even excommunication in Judaism. That happened to me.
Yeah, which we will get into. Heresy today, I think of it as not just a religious phenomenon, but we see it in a number of ways, especially in politics. And some would say that politics is, our civic religion, but we see the equivalent of shunning and excommunication and shaming of one side or the other. I mean, left wing, right wing. Liz Cheney, one of the stalwarts of the Republican Party, is effectively excommunicated from the Republican Party and shunned. This is not really different. This is just another example. The whole idea of rhinos, Republican in name only. They don't deserve to be called Republicans. And it's not that different on the far left as well. I don't want to be too
Yeah,
imbalanced.
but aside from politics, closer to home, if you're in New York and you're part of the Hasidic community, there are many sects there. The Lubavitchers don't talk to the Satmars. Every single group, they have their own dress code. They have their own schools. They don't associate. They don't even talk to each other. And they're, very religious Jews.
Right. But they consider each other Jews.
Jews,
Unlike
but not to be associated with.
Yeah.
This is, what is the extent of community? I mean, what, your own close?
Just your tribe?
Yes. Well, that's what it is.
That's what it is.
All right, next, please. Violations. Just from the New York Times, this is about 2 weeks ago, I came across this article about a pastor who was declared a heretic. He lost his pulpit. And I want to read just a very short paragraph from that article. This is, while watching TV, a TV report in the 1990s on children starving during the Rwanda genocide, Bishop Pearson had an epiphany. He could not believe that God would consign innocent souls to hell who had not accepted Jesus Christ as Savior before death. He concluded that hell does not exist except as earthly misery created by human beings, and that God loves all mankind, that everyone is always already saved. But he paid the price.
Yeah, kicked out.
Kicked out. Heretic.
Heretic. Outrage in his congregation for speaking in such a sacrilegious way.
Many examples. You come across them in the news all the time.
Right. Well, it's next, Jerry. It's, just an example of what, frankly, we see all too often, which is this moral outrage.
Yes.
It seems that we're aflame with it.
So there are lots of violations listed there, but basically it's, if you had a social psychologist try to analyze that, it would say these are heresies that are moral judgments, made from the gut, that it's a strong reaction, made in a split second. But any reasoning to justify that really comes from, thin evidence. You broke this as it is written rule, or our code says this. So it becomes thin evidence. But we're not dealing with evidence. We're dealing with a harsh gut reaction. There are violations that threaten the group existence, violations of pollution of thought. Jimmy Carter had pollution of thought, didn't he?
Yeah, lust in his heart.
Yes. Violations of perceived harmful behavior. Violations of purity, sanctity, and divinity. I particularly take note of purity. That's always, bugged me because I see that kind of understanding of purity as being a judgment. And a judgment can be filled with fallacy. It is an opinion. Purity that is not a judgment is really science. The purity of gold, as opposed to the purity of heart.
Right. A quick story on purity. I went to Russia in 1990 and fell in with a group of artists, and we sat around talking, and they got onto the subject of being pure Russian. And this was a big deal back in 1990. Being pure Russian. And I raised my hand and I said, well, I'm pure Russian because my roots are in what was then Russia. And one of them turns around and says, no, you're pure Juden. They went, wow.
Yeah.
So purity.
So
yeah, dangerous.
The business of violation of group existence could be so threatening, again, referring to the ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic people in New York. They have their own ways of protecting. Have you heard of the kosher phone? It's a flip phone. No access to the internet. No TikTok, no Wikipedia or anything that might lead you off the path. There is no television being used because, God forbid, you might see something that might cause you to be curious.
How is this different, in fact, from book banning? That is, we see it happening all over.
Yes.
This is threatening group existence, threatening pollution of thought. This whole idea of moral outrage, it's the current fashion. It's the cancer culture. It's censuring, firing, public disgrace. If you are not of the group that I am part of.
So if we want to maintain the purity, and I'm thinking, we're talking about the Jews, but how about the Amish? They've got their own closed societies and they have their rules. And I mean, there was one point in a teenager, I think they're around 18, they have Rumspringer or something like that, where you're allowed to go out for a year and test the world. But if you come back, you are there for life and follow all the rules. Otherwise, don't come back.
Well, I mean, on the one hand, they are generally respected because they belong to one another, but they are not adverse to other
They're not
groups.
evangelizing and trying to convert you to their way.
On the other hand, I would wonder if one is a longtime member and leaves the group, what kind of reaction there is. I don't know if there'd be something akin to shunning or at least deep disappointment.
Well, more than just disappointment, yes.
Okay, next year.
So how do we cope? Even our diverse multicultural society, there exist insular groups, which we've been talking about, with beliefs and behaviors concerning heresy that impact us today. But how can we hold our beliefs without infringing on the rights of others? How to cope? Well, my coping was to find my own group. Who knows what forces were involved that one day Carl Glassman came over to our house and said to Sharon and myself, we had newly moved into our home in New Hope near the Wedgwood, and Carl said, we're starting a shul. And what is my wonderful ex-Catholic wife said, great. And I was stunned, but I said, well, let me see how this plays out. I had not considered myself a Jew for 45 years.
Nothing,
nothing other than, making matzah bread.
Oh yeah, with bacon.
Oh, we'll get to that. But the surprising thing is I didn't know who these people were. I didn't know what their belief systems are, what the rules were, but they didn't throw me out, even to this day.
So, I mean, and you were very lucky, although the jury's still out. But coping as a heretic, either you are able to find a group that accepts you for who you are, for your intrinsic value, and you are welcomed and you have a sense of belonging, or you're coping as a heretic and you just, because this is the other side, and this is noteworthy as well.
Yeah.
You stand up against the criticism, you cope, even if you are being shunned or questioned or, charged. So, I mean, there's also coping when you stand your ground.
Yes.
If it's out of a belief that happens to be counter to that group.
It's really a double-edged sword in coping because you want the freedom to choose and to explore and to be curious at the same time. Nobody really wants to be rejected.
Right. Yeah, I mean, happiness or living a meaningful life, a sense of belonging is one of the pillars of that, and that's true for everybody. But yeah, coping can either mean finding a better place for yourself or standing up in the face of being opposed. So both ways.
Okay, next. So all of this started when, I guess a year and a half, 2 years ago, I came across a promotion of this book called Hidden Heretics. And right away I saw myself. So I get the book and I read it and I said, this is fascinating. Thought I should do a program on this. And ended up, diverging from that and doing what we're doing right now. But this was the work of an anthropologist, Jewish woman who's Orthodox but not Hasidic, but who was a professor of anthropology at Fordham, who managed to embed herself in a whole circle of like underground, hidden Hasidic people, men and women. It might have been one partner of a married couple, or, but they managed to hide their doubts and their concerns and try to explore through WhatsApp. These private discussion groups where they managed to underground have a forbidden, smartphone.
Right.
And
And
this-
network.
Yes, that
And a
was a
large
violation.
network?
That was a violation, but I guess they hid it somewhere, I guess. And they would have a community to discuss ideas and voice their thoughts. And then on occasion, they would get together at some distant place, they take on a whole new identity. And the reason they didn't just leave is because it would have been a terrible price for their families to pay. If you are caught, your kids are kicked out of that school. And you really can't go to another school. I mean, you're out of the community. If many of these people, because they don't subscribe to secular education, don't have the skills, although some do, to go out in the marketplace and support themselves independently. They become really trapped. Their children would not be acceptable for marriage within the group. They'd be outsiders. They'd be like Goyim. They wouldn't do this in order and end up sacrificing not just themselves but their families, and they couldn't do that. So they decided to remain hidden and suffer, which really seems like a sad story.
It's a terrible story.
Yeah.
They're living double lives, but I also think it's a dilemma that all of us face from time to time, maybe not so dramatically, but how many times do we not speak out when we know that there is a grave threat that could use our voice, but we don't do it? Or when we want to correct somebody's disrespectful comment or worse, and we don't do it because we're in a group, or it would be either inconvenient or opposed. I mean, isn't that a double life?
Yes.
in a way?
It is a double life. It's a dilemma. It's a false life. I want to read just a couple of short statements from the book that I think will really reflect on us and our particular community. One of them says, many dream of teaching their children that living as ultra-Orthodox Jews is not the only way to be moral Jews, that questioning is healthy, and that they should pursue their own happiness wherever that took them.
I mean, that's people in this
group,
hidden
yes,
world.
Yes.
Mhm.
Another person was quoted as saying, the Torah should be like Reconstructionist Judaism that keeps mitzvot because it is their culture. And that's believing in Torah as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's sad that they can't embody what they're saying right there.
Yeah.
And they can't hold to Orthodox beliefs and at the same time embrace certain values and customs that one would consider secular.
Yes, if they could survive, they would join us.
Okay, well, we accept you. Can we support them?
Next, please. This slide, because what's this joke about 2 Jews, 3 opinions? Well, here in Israel, there are the settlers with their batons wanting to do mean things, and then here are these women who are only asking to be treated as civil human beings. So we have our own tensions that are far-reaching in Israel and here and around the world. There's always this kind of tension between a religious life versus a secular life. And why could that not be bridged in some way? You just have to be flexible.
Well, and I think our last slide sort of gets to it is, and it's on all of our minds because as Jews, this division is incredibly painful and seems somehow insoluble. How do you solve this? And next slide.
But no, well, before we do that, Gary, I wanted to just add to that another childhood experience of being shamed because of the differences between acting in a way that is not necessarily meant to be heretical, but it's not conforming to laws. When I was a child, and if I did something, and I'm reminded of that, of my experience when a friend told me about their experience with their grandchild who's being raised as an Orthodox Jew. The grandmother is not Orthodox, but still very much Jewish, where something was done. I pick up a pen, but it's Shabbos. And the child was taught to shame somebody, say muktzah. That's where I
Muktzah?
Muktzah.
Muktzah.
Muktzah. That was saying it is forbidden.
Sounds like the name for a
But
pet.
it says it is forbidden. You violate it. So in other words, you call somebody out and you shame them.
Did you get shamed?
Yes.
You were mukta?
Yes, Mukta.
Mukta.
Mr. Mukta. All right.
It sounds so innocent, endearing almost.
Yes.
Okay. So,
Yeah, this is kind of an expression of our worldview, place for reason, ritual, and learning. Now, earlier in my life, I was ready to dispense with rituals, but I've come to understand that rituals really do have enormous power. And even Jewish atheists they like to observe religious holidays, traditions. Some even pray without believing in God. Witness the crowds that we have, bulging during Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur or for Hanukkah candle lighting. And the rest of the time, it's lots of room in the place. Many describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. I understand that. I sort of see myself that way. And they practice, and we practice, even religious people, meditation. And praying is a meditation. And we focus on the community of the world.
I look at this and I see in it the way, as narrow as it is, to achieve some rapprochement between the orthodoxy and the secular world. And, these things. Reason is a human trait, and the ability to have a conversation and listen to one another and understand in that way the reason behind the different views is a step to progress. Ritual, respecting the rituals that are important to the other as not only a sign of respect, but understanding a little bit more about what's important and what matters to them, and learning. It seems, when I study with Yitzhak Skolnick every Tuesday at 3:00, I always think of him, he's teaching, he says, no, we are learning together. And now we have a lot of differences, but it seems that these are the keys. If there is going to be some type of coming together, these are key elements of that.
One of the surprising things for me is in learning through anthropology writings that every culture has their rituals, every culture has their cosmic stories, every culture has their practices. Not a single group without it.
Right.
And that, and for us in particular, being people of the book, that education, learning, study is part of a good life. And if it's more open, it's part of an enlightened life. And it's also a spiritual practice, much more spiritual than sitting with a book and really being, getting an epiphany out of that.
Right. And giving full vent to your curiosity.
Yeah.
That's the ultimate in being human.
So I noticed, before we go to the next one, that there are a couple of items that I came across in the paper. In fact, one of them today in the newspaper. But before that, I want to explain that the Hasidic movement, when it was started by the Baal Shem Tov in the 18th century in Europe. And he did so because he felt that Judaism had overemphasized intellectual qualities of Judaism to the detriment of spiritual fervor and sincerity.
Too much time in the yeshiva and not dancing?
I don't know. I guess so, yes. But as a counterpoint, there was an article actually in this morning's New York Times. And there was actually an article that I know that Rabbi Diana came across because she used that in last week's Torah study, which, by the way, I go to religiously.
As I do.
And that it's the work of a Rabbi Sharon Bruce from LA. And she writes, this is one little sentence out of a long article in today's paper. One of the great casualties of tribalism is curiosity. And when we are no longer curious, when we don't try to imagine or understand what another person is thinking or feeling, or where there is pain, or where her pain comes from, our hearts begin to narrow. We become less compassionate, more entrenched in our own worldviews.
Okay, that's a great place to pause and get to the more personal side of our.
So here we have two heretics. Notice that David's smiling. He had every freedom in the world. I'm not smiling because I didn't.
You're not necessarily angry. You're sort of puzzled. It looks like to me.
Okay.
So all right, we're going to interview one another and learn about each other's experience and their particular heresy, what led up to it, what are the consequences of it. And so I'm going to begin by questioning my brother Abraham. So Abraham, you grew up in an Orthodox household. Tell us a little bit about what that was like from what you can remember and how you felt about it.
Well, I am first generation. Both my parents are immigrants, not from the same place. My mother was 14 when she came with her mother from Russia. My father immigrated alone at the age of 19. He was born in Jerusalem.
Mm.
They were not equipped to live in the modern world. America was the vision was the streets were paved with gold. Well, they didn't find any gold, except we lived in a neighborhood in Philadelphia, now becoming fashionable, but then it had been a haven for Jewish immigrants from the 30s. And by the time I was born, it was starting to change. In my years there, it became a dangerous, derelict inner city, hotbed of crime and violence. Mm. So we were mostly confined to the house. There were some Jews. There was a little shul still nearby. There were four of us. I was the youngest of four. And we lived in a closed society where here's what you do. You daven, you do the prayer before the meal, you do the prayer after the meal, you go to the shul, so many times a day. You do every little thing, every little practice of, for the holidays, for all kinds of things. And as a kid, this is what you do. This is what life is. And that was okay. But that changed, as I got a little bit older, and I was not in an environment. If my parents could afford it, they would have me in a solid Jewish area. If you lived in Borough Park, that's all you see. You say, well, this is the world. Mm. Well, I saw a different world stepping out of the house.
Right. So you went. Did that start when you went to public school?
Yes. And there, I was a minority. Things were very different. There were virtually no people like me. And I was kind of hiding, I would play marbles or run around playing dodgeball or whatever in the schoolyard. And God forbid if I should be so physical that my tzitzis would pop out and hang out of my shirt and say, "Hey, what's up, man?"
And you'd be scrambling to stuff it back in.
You're right. So
You were mortified.
yes, I didn't know what to make of that. So here we had this rules, but there were some people, but most of the world didn't do these things.
Hmm.
And I was curious about it.
So when something like that would happen, did you go home, you mention it? Did
No,
you had talk
no,
at
no,
all
I just
about?
internalized that. I mean, it wasn't until I was old enough and going to high school and I was fortunate that I had special aptitudes. I wasn't going to be a mathematician or a writer, but I could draw.
Hmm.
And so that was my ticket. I ended up I actually followed my brother by going to a vocational high school in Philadelphia because I didn't expect to go to college. We had no money, none.
Right.
And I was surprised because I had, lots of support from teachers and they did all kinds of stuff. And we need to get a portfolio. And I didn't really understand what was happening until the graduation when it was announced that I was given a 4-year scholarship.
You did not know that?
I
was
did not
coming?
know that was coming.
So they basically put your portfolio
Yes,
together
yes.
and sent it on.
Yeah,
Can we
yes.
do a movie about this?
Yeah, you're right. That changed my life. It gave me an
Fantastic.
occupation. It gave me self-sufficiency. It gave me independence. 2 days after I finished school, I left at home. Of course, I couldn't afford to be elsewhere. I moved out, I got a job in New York, and I was gone.
Hmm. So you're now living in New York? Where do you?
I ended up, even with my first job, it's Manhattan, that I was working, but I ended up finding a little basement apartment in Flatbush. I used to take the IRT, the end of the line. I was lucky because I was always at the end of the line on both sides and I always got a seat.
But you were not yet excommunicated.
No, I still
because
related
you
to
were
my
still
family.
going home.
Yeah, I would come home for holidays. I'd do things like that. I was not gone,
So would you
but
be
I lived it.
participating in any rituals while you were home? Were you
Only when I was
were you
home. I was
going to
faking.
shul?
I
You
was
were faking it?
Faking
You were
it, yes.
living a hidden life?
Double life.
A double life?
Yes.
So how would you fake it? Give me an example.
Well, I mean, when I was still living at home, after my bar mitzvah, I had to put on tefillin, and I did so for about a year. And then, but we used to do that in a little room on the first floor, and I would go in, and close the door, sit there.
You wouldn't wrap to fill.
And I would not. I would just come out and lie. Say, I did that.
Okay. And then there was also, that was later, the bacon fat. Okay,
Right.
we'll get into that. So, but all right, so you're still part of the tribe
Yes.
and you're working in New York, you're in Gotham, surrounded by all kinds of distractions,
Yeah.
which included females.
Not a whole lot.
No?
No, I mean, I was really kind of, the nerd, But I ultimately, after I left New York, I ended up, getting a job in the Valley Forge area, and I moved back home for a little while. But then I moved out to Bucks County. It was there that then I started having a relationship.
And you
And
got
I
married?
ended up getting married, and I called my mother and told her, and she was sad. But my
Sad
father,
because the woman you married wasn't Jewish.
that's right.
And they weren't at your wedding.
Yeah, and I really didn't want to marry a Jewish woman.
Yeah, you were done.
I was done. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
I really didn't want to identify because to me, it meant all these rules. This is why I said it was such a surprise to me when I stumbled accidentally across this group called Kehilat Hanahar that didn't throw me out.
All right, but we'll get to that because that's the good part of the story.
Yes.
But you're married now.
Yes.
Your
right,
father, what's his
Well,
reaction?
I was out of his life.
Okay, so
And
that was
and my
the
mother
point.
was so obedient, I was out of her life too, which really made me very sad.
and never to be joined with
Yeah,
your mother.
no. I once went to see her when she was in a hospital, and she barely knew I was there. My mother died, and I didn't go to her funeral.
Mm.
I pretended like it didn't exist, and it was really a very sad, experience.
Sure.
But that changed when my father, who lived another 15 years, developed Parkinson's. He was alone. My brother moved in to be his caregiver.
Mm.
My brother said, "You come, bring your family." I said, "What do you mean bring my family? He doesn't want me there." He said, "What's he gonna do?" Okay, so we show up. And he says hello to me. He says hello to my then wife. He greets my kids. And I am trying to be gracious, but I'm livid with rage. I want to curse him out. I'm so angry with him. He says, "In your need, you become civil."
Right.
And you blocked your wife, my mother, from ever seeing her grandchildren.
Horrible. Can't run that tape again.
No.
So at that point, you're completely severed from the family.
Yes. Yes.
And so
Only my brother didn't reject me. My sisters did too. I was out of their lives too. Yeah, one of them is ultra orthodox, the other one is Hasidic.
right. And you're
My brother is conservative.
conservative. So okay, now you have a family.
Yes.
You have kids.
Yes, and we do the thing. We Christmas tree gifts.
Right.
Hardly
Nothing
any,
Jewish.
Well, the only thing Jewish it was a violation. I'll tell the story now about it's Passover, and they have matzahs in the store. They're bringing them some matzah, and I love making matzah bread. I couldn't find any schmaltz. I used bacon fat.
Bacon fat. Oh yeah, yeah. Your father would have loved that. Okay, so you go 45 years, and there's nothing Jewish about your life.
Nothing, because I equate my understanding of what Jewish is to the fire and brimstone of my early years. I had no idea that there was, a group like this.
Right. So
Just haven't thrown me out yet.
So how did your experience, this road you traveled of being in an Orthodox environment and then being totally free of it and not Jewish for all intents and purposes, and then finding yourself in, KHN? Did this journey, how did it
was
affect
more
you?
to it. I mean, in some respect, I've always been a seeker. So over the years, past 30 years, I've immersed myself in reading and travel to understand other spiritual ideas. I went for years, every Tuesday night to the Buddhist Center here in Lambertville. Cher and I traveled a lot. Cher and I spent 6 weeks embedded in southern India with a Hindu family, teaching at the school, going with them to the temple, eating with our right hands off of a banana leaf, doing everything that they were doing together with this Hindu family. That taught us a lot of respect for their ways.
Yeah, yeah. And the only way you could gain that really was by doing it,
by doing it, and also
you can't read about
it. There was zero tourists in our experience during those 6 weeks.
Quite a journey.
Yes.
And now you are Abraham, adult ed emeritus, the source of so much learning and inspiration at KHN.
Well, I have to give credit to going to Torah study, which I do religiously.
Oh, the rabbi's back.
Yes. Because, when I was a child, I learned to read Hebrew. I was able to read Hebrew fluently, which unfortunately I've lost. I could stumble through it now. But the sad part is I never learned Hebrew. So it wasn't until I'm reading all the parshas and all the books, we went through all the books over the years in translation that I finally got to understand what they meant.
Hmm,
The only thing I understood was rules.
yeah,
Now I have meaning.
that's great.
And what I have is something that I could love, that there's a very positive aspect to this.
Yeah,
There's an enrichment.
you have a community that loves
Yeah,
you.
God bless you.
All right, so are you going to grill me now?
Yes, yes, yes,
The great reveal.
yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. So now, David, you said that you were given every freedom of choice as a child and young adult. And you suggested this was a problem. So tell me, what's wrong with being free as a bird?
Well, there's nothing wrong with being free. It's something we all want to be free, like the birds and dogs running around. The issue with freedom, especially when you're young and you don't necessarily have guideposts or signs, it's you don't use it. You don't really use that freedom as you might. And in my case, growing up, I grew up in a wonderful house, so we have no issues. My parents were very loving. They provided an environment that was incredibly nourishing as far as the arts and music and literature, and I loved all of it, and I do to this day. What was missing, although I never really identified it as such, was sort of a spiritual practice. There really was none. We were Jews, proud of it. We lived in a predominantly Jewish area. We went to the synagogue 3 or 4 times a year. We had Passover, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur dinners that were probably violated many of the rules that one should conduct those events. But that was it. You know, we were in some ways, you know, barely Jewish, and at the same time, okay, so this is in the 60s. I'm in high school. I'm reading Siddhartha. I'm reading Gibran. I'm reading various texts. I decide early on that I'm a Taoist. I read Lao Tzu, the Tao Te Ching. I read all 89 little essays, and wow, to me, that was really exciting. And obviously, looking back, it was fulfilling for me in a way that I wasn't experiencing at home. So when I went to college, I went with this curiosity for learning about these things that was ignited. And then there was another layer. When I was in college in 1968 through 71, we had the war. We had this thing called counterculture. And I was right in the full bastion of counterculture. I, like many others, sort of lived for when I could piss my father off by doing something, you know, stupid in looking back, like sending my draft card to the Justice Department and calling my father immediately. But I was in opposition then to the culture and my upbringing, even though, again, there was nothing wrong with it, but it wasn't giving me what I wanted. And there was one other thing. In college, I got very into communes and communities. And for the last 2 years I was in school, we went up to Woodstock, we visited different communes, and I felt that there was something important in that, this whole idea of brotherhood and living and, you know, being brothers and sisters and, you know, singing songs together. This was all
Kumbaya.
Kumbaya, yes. I was a kumbayas.
David, you seem like you're the angry young man. I mean,
I do now?
Well, you know, you make a point of pissing off your father.
Yeah.
I mean, were you angry at him that he didn't give you more meaning?
That's a good point. It's interesting because my parents, as was the case with many Jewish parents, it was pretty clear what they wanted for me.
Mhm.
And they wanted me to excel. They wanted me to be the best, to go to a Ivy League school and become something that they would be proud of. And I mean, to make this long story short, they are proud of me, and they got there. But there was a big interim that they were not. They were confused, hurt, and angry, which I'm going to get to. So yeah, I don't know that it was an anger, but I was contrarian, and I wanted to make that point.
Okay, and you
And
did.
I did.
And what
College really, so much so that when I was in college, with 1 year to go, I said, this is not relevant. I'm tired of this. I'm not learning anything that's important. I want to leave. And my father, interestingly, said, fine, go. And I went, what? So I decided to cram everything into one more semester, finished early, hit the road, went to California. That's what any, counterculture Jewish kid would do. Thumbed it to California to find what? I don't know what. And I looked up a friend who I'd been at Penn with at school, and he was living with this commune, or they called themselves the Creative Community Project. And I stopped there. There were about 12 or 13 of them. And I worked for a day in their company cleaning, their cleaning company. And they asked me if I wanted to hear some of the lectures. And yeah, of course I'd love to. And well, I sat down. I had a friend with me who went with me. No, he didn't want to hear any lectures. He took off, became a cardiac surgeon in Boulder, Colorado. But no, I wanted to hear the lectures. And I heard one lecture, and then I heard a second lecture. And I thought, wow, this rings true. This is affecting me. I think that I'm going to do this. That's in that moment. I said, I'm going to do this. This may be a crazy ride. It may be a problem for many people, but I'm stopping here. They sort of flipped my card, and I'm doing it. And so that was really the beginning of my involvement in a group that became later on identified as Reverend Moon's Unification Church, more popularly known as the Moonies.
I introduce here a Mooney.
And I will also say that I became, a more influential person in this group, and happened to be, and I was there for 5.5 years, which is pretty extraordinary. I was in San Francisco being interviewed by local television, and the guy, his name was Tim Fox, puts a microphone in my face and says, so what is it like being a Moonie? And I went, say what? I had never heard that phrase. So I feel like it was tried on me first. But yeah, I had an extraordinary experience during that time.
So do you feel that it answered your need for a spiritual life, was fulfilling?
Yeah, certainly it did for quite some time. I'd never lived in a religious community, which is what this was. Mm-hmm. We all worked. I worked as an engineer for Bagel, so I'd go to work every day and come back. But we did everything together, our meals together. We had a farm. There was prayer. There was fasting conditions, but we had a real camaraderie, and we would always be inviting people to come and hear the lectures like I did. And we had a farm, and for a long time, I felt I felt it was an intimation of what a world could be like. We were all young. We were all
Your
early 20s.
utopian experience.
It was very much a utopian
Okay.
experience.
It wasn't necessarily being a free agent, though.
No, it's a good point. I was really committed to sort of the rules and rituals of the group.
So you're saying the demand and commitment of a group can be enveloping and comforting. Would you say that?
I would say that. And I would also say in this case, because I was able to spend a good part of every day in a different world,
Okay.
that it relieved what might have felt a little bit oppressive, let's say.
Another part of the relief is that apparently anybody who made any money turned it in. You were relieved of all your
we
cash.
pooled the capital. But, while I was there, I was certainly never discouraged from my own reading and my own inquiry, and which in fact ultimately led to my departing, I would say. But it got dark in the last 2 years because of the rise in the sort of anti-cult reaction, and many regarded the Moonies as a cult, and maybe many of my friends on the call might have thought that, might still think. And so I got very involved in addressing what was this dark wave that was called deprogramming. That all of a sudden, parents in particular who felt that their children were being brainwashed and under mind control, notwithstanding the fact they were adults or young adults. And there emerged this whole industry of deprogrammers, which, were hired to both literally kidnap and trap and then work to change the mind of the victim. And so I got very involved in opposing that, both legally. I worked on a legal team, but also in certain appearances, which ultimately led to me being on Phil Donahue for 2 sessions, which I've never been able to see. I'm dying to see it, but I was asked to represent the church and go face off against 7 deprogrammers in front of a very hostile audience. Me, nice, David. It was, I won't forget it. And I decided before I went that I'm going to be articulate and calm and reasonable and address what I felt were serious wrongs, violation of civil and human rights, and et cetera, et cetera. And Phil Donahue, he was eating it up because the audience was so hostile. And they were like at times yelling at me. And at one point he runs into the audience and they ask a question and he runs back to me and he goes, "Is Reverend Moon the Messiah?"
So where are you now?
Anyway, my answer was, well, I don't. Time will tell. Which, by the way, didn't sit well with the group necessarily. You might have believed he was. Well, I never did. I never didn't. I didn't know. And so just to conclude this, he was so happy with the first session. He said, "Can we tape another right now? Will the audience stay?" They all stayed, and we did another. But I was a lot angrier the second time.
Yeah. So where are you now? I mean, you've returned. You reclaimed your Jewish identity, which you never really lost, but you.
Yeah, never stopped thinking of myself as a Jew. But I wasn't necessarily practicing it, although I would go with certain people in the group that would go home for a holiday and needed to bring a member of the group who was so upstanding and reasonable sounding, then I would go and have Pesach with them over there, or Rosh Hashanah over here. And I also stayed in touch with my parents, notwithstanding their, yeah, real grief over this, actually. They never came to grips with this, but I stayed in touch.
Okay.
And I did everything I could to assure them that I was still interested in how the Yankees did the night before. This would be a sure sign that I'm not totally lost. But I think in retrospect, what I got from it, really important, was a personal belief in God. I really got it based on what I learned there. It just made sense to me in that from almost the first moment. And so that's a big deal. That wasn't a Jewish God or a Mooney. That was just this idea about a
Whatever
creator,
that power is.
whatever it is.
Okay.
And so, but when I came back, of course, then I went to law school because that was my inspiration for leaving. I felt there's more I need to do. And it was actually while I was in the group sleeping on the floor, which I did for 5.5 years and sleeping. I was reading by flashlight a book called Five Smooth Stones by Anne Fairburn. And it was about civil rights and this young Black lawyer named David Champlin, who was quite the hero for me. And I decided, yeah, I'm going to law school. I'm going to do that. And that's how I came back.
David, we have just a few minutes left. I thought
when I got married, I would say, and had kids, is when I really became full-fledged Jewish again.
Well, that will do it.
That'll do it.
We have a few more minutes left, and I thought it'd be a good idea to open it up to our community to see if anybody has any questions for either Heretic. Just unmute yourself and ask away.
This is Alicia. I have a question. Let me I'll go back on video. So you talked earlier. First of all, thank you as always. Your programs and the two of you are such fabulous storytellers, and I really appreciate you putting yourselves out there and sharing yourselves. You talked about the political divide and the heretics and things like that. Any thoughts or words of wisdom on how we begin to heal in this country between the two sides and get back to the things that we all align with, caring for others and things like that?
We could start by talking to one another.
That's what I was going to say.
This business of, I had mentioned earlier about, even within the Hasidic community, they don't talk to each other. We just need to respect the humanity of other people with differences.
Yeah, I would agree. And when Bill Bradley was running for president, his short campaign, I was working for him and had a conversation one time because his stump speech was always about race. And it was always about the only solution to racial problems was conversation, real conversation. Otherwise, nothing would change. And I think that's the same thing here. It's just really hard. It's really hard to have an open, honest sharing. But that's the only way, I believe.
Anyone else?
I wanted to add that when we're talking about tribes and honor killings, it really is so embedded in our culture all the way down to the streets. When gangs kill one another, it's because he disrespected me. And so it's an honor killing. And the shaming in social media is also a perfect example of how all of these behaviors have really embedded themselves in our culture all throughout the centuries. We don't use the word heretic, but the truth is that in any group that ostracizes others, shames them, kills them, makes fun or ridicules, it's all there. And again, I'd like to thank you both for sharing, because I think we what fascinates me always is to hear people's stories and learn from them. And I certainly did learn a lot today. And I really want to thank you for all of that.
Anyone else? What's this?
This
Star Heresy.
We've just been awarded.
Click, click and clack, heretics
Yeah, yeah.
together.
Actually, David, I do have a question. This is Bonnie. This is the first time I'm joining your session, and I'm really religiously very ignorant, naive, and distance person. So I'm listening to all this, and I am just curious, like the journeys that the both of you have gone through since you were a young person and now, and fast forward to now, would you have done anything different? Would you have like for the young people today, they're so lacking of any anchor, right? So and all these thoughts are like swimming in my head right now. So I just wanted to hear what your comments or your thoughts are.
I don't know that I would have done anything different because I wasn't in control. I mean, it would have been nice to have a different kind of household, but I have no control over that. I could have done more if I had support going through school with more knowledgeable parents. But I have no, that's just playing with ideas.
And
I don't know.
I mean, looking back, would I have done different given what followed? No, I would have made that same impulsive move because I was so curious and I felt I'd only understand it by throwing myself in it. I did confuse a lot of people and had a real issue with my parents for a long time, although I've been fully forgiven for my trespasses, and we're great together. And I went on to have a life that I'm happy with. But I knew that this was going to be really controversial, what I was going to do. So no, I wouldn't do it different. One of my daughters was on, and I have asked myself the question, or been asked, yeah, but what if your kids did what you did? How would you feel? And that's a real tough one because, I don't know how. I think I'd like to think that I would want them to follow, their own idea. But yeah, it's a tricky question.
I did learn that force is not a good technique for being a parent.
Force.
Yes.
You mean based on your experience?
Yes.
You mean imposing your will on your children?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
I was never physical with them. Never.
Abraham,
Yes.
it's Miriam. When you were estranged from your family, if anybody asked you what your religion was, would you have said Jewish?
When I was a child?
No, when you were
No,
estranged.
when you were estranged from your family.
Yeah, I probably would. I mean, I think with my name and my appearance is probably perfectly obvious, but I didn't disidentify. I just never, volunteered that.
Thank you.
But you have experience in your own family with your niece and this kind of.
My niece became Orthodox, and her daughter, my grandniece, gave up Orthodoxy in a very defiant manner and left home. But she never gave up Judaism, and in fact, she's making Aliyah. She's going to Israel in 3 weeks.
Good for her.
But not as an Orthodox woman.
But she'll have good company there. The Orthodox is only like 10% or 20%, so something like that. She'll have plenty of good Jewish circles.
Yes.
This is Alicia. I do want to share another story. I have Hasidic cousins, and there was one of my cousins who tried to leave the sect, and it's very challenging, and it's very and if you don't have a strong emotional center, I mean, she ended up committing suicide because of the challenges of being considered a heretic and trying to leave. So it's a challenge, but I also do want to share that my father he grew up Orthodox, conservative, never belonged to a shul, and I'm the first person in my family to belong to a shul. And it was just a very, he actually taught me to be a heretic in a way of going against whatever it was. His story was, if there's an oil truck burning, don't go be the people who stand around and watch it. You walk the other way and you think for yourself. So it was it's fascinating. Again, thanks for sharing.
We thank you for being with us.
Rabbi.
Rabbi.
You hear me?
Yes. We can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
I can't hear them.
we can hear you.
There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Were there any, David, any social repercussions from the other end when you left? Did people try to grab you back in? Are you in touch with anyone? A, and B, was it all one big discontinuity with the rest of your life, or has there been some continuity between the teachings you learned and like the Judaism and the mystical tradition that you've dove into? So both those things.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. So first of all, when I left, and obviously on that end, I'm sure that it was a little bit of a bombshell, at least for that group. And I had sort of put the burden of proof on myself that this was the right thing to do, whether it was ultimately the right thing to do in that moment. And I actually did a 7-day fast to clean myself out. So I made the right choice. And then I had one of the people that always assisted me there, drove me to the bus station, and I left, knowing that they would try to persuade me to stay. And they did. And we had phone calls, including with the leader of the group, a Korean woman who I loved and was very powerful. And she said, she called me, I answered, she went, David, that's what she called me. David, you come home right now. And I said, no, that's what I said. And it took a lot to do that. But since then, first of all the people that I was with, other than one, all are no longer there, but all still married to their spouses, all have kids, and are all wonderful. And we're all in touch. And two of them in particular that I've remained very close to. But I have a great affection for all of them. The efforts to get me back, some people did fly to New York. We went out and talked, but so that's that end of it. As far as what I learned, when I came back, I was in such a cloistered environment, like in a personal way. I mean, sleeping on the floor, celibate, in my early 20s for 5.5 years, and all of a sudden being back in the world and trying to figure out how to behave, how to live now in this world. Not different, I think, than coming out of an orthodoxy. And I remember making rules for myself, one of which was if I was going to be in a relationship with somebody, I had to be able to assign to that permanence, that I was willing to be permanently friends or involved, but things like that. And so I think there were a lot of ethical principles that I learned there in terms of mutual respect and caring. And, we really were like brothers and sisters And yet we didn't know each other at all when we started. So, yeah, it was, yeah. I mean, I know that people had different experiences, and for many people who might have wanted to leave, it was not it was not maybe as easy. It was not easy for me, but they couldn't do it necessarily the way I did.
We thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. And
Thank you so much.
yeah, stay warm.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank